Okay, well, welcome everybody. And I just wanted to welcome you all to the Solar Noon Tuesday. I'm going to change some of the view here. I'm going to go ahead and get started with this week's news in solar and then jump into a couple of questions if we have them. And then I thought we could talk a little bit about a topic that came up. It had to do with how much energy is embedded in some of these renewable energy technologies and are they actually green? And then Don had sent me some things about some cool, cheap electric vehicles. So I thought we'd touch on some of that. Okay, so the Uyghur, let's see, the Uyghur, somebody's kicking back. I'm gonna go ahead and mute you there. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act begins today, and that's June 21st, actually. And what that is it bans the import of any materials made in, and I believe it's called the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in China. It's in the northwest part of China. If you manufacture something in that region, you have to prove that forced labor, or essentially slave labor, was not used in the production of this material, not only by your company, but by any of the subcontractors, any of the distributors, any of that nature. One of the issues where it relates to solar is 50% of the world's polysilicon comes from that region. So that has led to some severe disruptions again in supply chain issues. Not that that's an issue, since we're dealing with slavery here that we're talking about. But as a result, hundreds of megawatts of solar panels have been detained as they go through the paperwork, trying to see whether or not there's been slave labor involved in the production of these materials. Ohio Congressman Tim Ryan just introduced what I think is in competition for the most torturous acronym of a bill that's ever been introduced into Congress. This particular one is known as the Ensuring America Gets Legitimate Energy Sourced, Originated, and Leased at Home Reliability Act, which acronym is EAGLE Solar. So basically what this is they want to, he's arguing that we should, all federal projects, including power purchase agreements. So if the federal government purchases power from a company, then all of those arrays have to be made with domestically US manufactured solar products. Now it should be noted that Tim Ryan is currently running for US Senate in Ohio. He's the Democratic nominee. And he also represents the district where First Solar is located, which is America's largest manufacturer of solar panels. So not that he has any skin in the game there. And FERC has implemented some new interconnection rules. I sort of put these rules, these are going into effect immediately, but these are sort of in the rulemaking world where you think they should have already been in place long ago. They want to establish that the utilities have to abide by firm deadlines for reviewing interconnection applications. They are saying that if multiple projects are being proposed for an area that impacts the same part of the grid, these can be reviewed as a cluster as opposed to as individual projects, which apparently is the way it happens now. That these reviews should be based on actual information and not theoretical modeling, which again, seems like a kind of a no-brainer, and that the process should be transparent so that if you're applying, you should know what's going on, and if there's a problem, you should know what that problem is and how you can correct it. So this is what CEA, the Solar Energy Industries Administration or Association, said they were excited to see FERC was taking such bold action. So I hope they were being satirical when they said that, or ironic, but I don't think they were. Okay, so the solar executives have lobbied Congress about the investment tax credit extension. Currently, the investment tax credit is set to expire at the end of next year. They're hoping to extend this. The proposals are to ramp it back up to 30%, extend it for 10 years, also to include storage only. So if you're putting in batteries, that would count whether or not there's renewable energy associated with it. And they're looking at a 10% bonus if you make the project more than 55% from domestically produced solar product stuff. That seems to be a theme that's going through everything at the moment. And or if it's put in a low income area. And then this, to me, I think this is probably the top news of the week. Perovskite's in the news. Princeton University has just developed a process where they've manufactured a perovskite cell that will meet commercial longevity standards. So they're saying these cells will survive without breaking down at least 30 years in the field. So when perovskite came out, I've talked about this in a number of meetings, but it really has a lot of potential of revamping the industry. But there were three major problems. One was that it tends to break down out in the environment. It degrades. Well, Princeton has just said they've overcome that issue. The second one was that they do contain lead, and this lead tends to leach out. Although a study in Tokyo recently found ways of manufacturing it without toxic materials. And then the Stanford just came out with a manufacturing process that they claim will reduce the cost of production of perovskite to about 25 cents per square foot, which is about 1/10 the cost of producing a silicon cell. So basically, we're looking at these modules. The efficiency of them now is 25% or better. So they're actually more efficient than silicon. They're going to cost 1/10 the cost of silicon, and they're apparently not going to degrade any faster than silicon and not cause any environmental problems, at least that we're aware of at the moment. So with all of those issues in place, I think we're about ready to see perovskite just go crazy. So, okay, so that was the news this week. So I know, Ben, you had an issue or a question about disconnects. Why don't we address that?
Yeah, I had a quick question about the perovskite since you just mentioned that. That perovskite, the materials that they're using to source that, is that more easily attained, or what is the material that goes into that?
Yeah, my understanding is that perovskite as a term is actually a class of materials, sort of like if we said crystalline or something like that. But it's readily available, readily sourced. It's, I think, I might be wrong, but I had heard that it was, from the Earth's, it's a volcanic source thing, or it can be manufactured. But we're also talking, it's an application thin film process. So they're using very, very little amounts of material, really just one molecule thick or 2 molecules thick for the top layer and the bottom layer. So it is a thin film technology, and it's a inkjet or an application type technology as opposed to a with silicon. They've got to take the silicon, melt it, create the wafers, and thin film. They're talking about it's just a spray on kind of technology. So any surface that can receive paint could be a solar panel using perovskite as the material that's being sprayed on.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow.
And when we get into the embedded energy thing, which I was going to talk about, The difference in the amount of payback time, I'll give you a little preview on that, is with silicon, because of the energy it takes in melting the silicon and the like, there's about a 1.5 to 3 year payback, basically meaning the amount of energy that cell will produce will take 3 years at the outside to recover the energy it took to manufacture it. But with perovskite, they're looking at 2 to 4 month payback for the solar panels, most of which will be in the manufacturing of the aluminum frame and the backing and the like. The actual manufacturing of the cells is almost nothing.
Wow. And if it gets like that, then what else are they going to be applying it to? And will there need to be the aluminum frame? And like, I think you had talked about one time about windows and potentially even wall panels and things, that if this perovskite could really be harnessed, they could apply it to anything.
Sure, the sides of skyscrapers, the roofing material, if you wanted to, metal roofing could be attached to it, could be car windows, could be the car frame itself, recharging electric vehicles just from the paint job on the vehicle, things like that. Or your laptop could generate all the power you need to run your laptop, just in the paint coating of the unit. So who knows? I mean, that's that George Jetson future that we're moving into. So. Okay, you had a question about disconnects.
Yeah, so I was working through chapter 7 in the book, and there's code has obviously changed, and now we've got this 10-foot rule, and the disconnects that they're going to be looking for at the location of the meter, emergency rescue crews and the code officials, when they come to the meter, what are they needing to see there, and what must be killed at that point?
Yeah. Well, the basic guidelines according to the NEC as far as the disconnect is they want them to be within sight, within 10 feet. That's the ideal. The disconnect needs to be clearly labeled that it is the system disconnect. It needs to be externally operable, meaning that you don't have to open the thing up to turn it off. So typically one of those external lever blade disconnects, and it has to be lockable. They don't say that you have to lock it, but they say that that's got to be an option, that you can lock it. What they're worried about is people being able to get in and touch the live connections. And I know your issue, you were saying that it may be impractical, if not impossible, to have it located where the meter is. And this happens quite regularly. I'll give you 2 examples I've run into. There was one at a school that I was involved with, and the meter was right next to the front door. And they're concerned that if you put the disconnect right there that says, hey, this shuts off the main PV system, every high school kid that walks through there is going to be flipping that disconnect.
Right.
And that was not the ideal situation. So that was one of the issues. Or I had another one where it was on a barn. We were going to be putting the array on a barn that was located, 50 feet away from the main house where the meter is. And there was a sub panel within the barn, so it made sense to just come down, connect right there outside of the barn. So the NEC does give you that option, that if it's impractical to put it right next to the meter, you can, with the permission of your inspector, put a little sign or a plaque that says, hey, the disconnect is located at this location. However you indicate to them. It could be, for instance, the barn one, we said the disconnect for the PV system is located at the northwest corner of the large red barn 50 feet behind us, that kind of thing. As long as your electrical inspector says that's fine, then it's fine.
That situation there even adds more to my situation, because that's almost exactly what I'm kind of tossing up right now. I've got the barn that's about 80 feet back, and I'm thinking about coming into that sub panel, and then I'm going through all this disconnect stuff, and I'm like, well, what in the heck? I'm gonna have to do something up at the house anyway, so maybe I shouldn't even be thinking about the barn, because at the house I've got 25 feet of concrete slab between where the meter is on the west wall and then the inside where the panel is, and everything else is basically off the south face of the house. So
Mhm.
it's just like opposite sides of the structure from where the meter is to where everything else would be happening. And then there's the possibility of not even using the house and actually going to the barn. But I'm like, well, I shouldn't even be thinking about that maybe.
Yeah. I think what I would do is go talk to your electrical inspector.
Okay.
Just see if there's going to be an issue with that. You know, it strikes me, and maybe my logic is wrong on this, but there's an awful lot of emphasis placed on this disconnect for a typical grid-tied system. But logically, if you come in as a first responder and pull the meter, because of rapid shutdown, your system's already turned off. You know, and so the disconnect is like a second safety valve to say, okay, now I'm going to be disconnecting just in case the rapid shutdown didn't work. So I guess I see it that if the grid is still functioning, or the meter is still in place, it's a good way of turning off the system. So it's not backfeeding the grid. So from the utility standpoint, that should be fine. But if a first responder comes in and pulls the meter, your system should be turned off, whether or not you've got a disconnect there or not. So
except for people that are putting in all these battery backup systems, and then
then
you pull
they're,
the meter and you've just kicked in battery power.
yeah, but then they're also supposed to have a rapid, a shutdown for the battery bank right there at the meter as well. So there you would have two disconnects, one for your battery bank and one for your PV array. And they would both have to be located within 10 feet of your meter. And we typically say the meter, but it's really the point of connection, the point of interconnection. Now with residential systems, that's going to be the meter. But in commercial systems, it might be more complicated than that. It might not be a meter per se. It might be an aggregation point. There might be multiple meters, so at that point, you've just got to kind of work it through with the inspector where they want to see that disconnect. So.
Are there any creative solutions to put disconnects out there if the inspector says, hey, I want these here? And that, like I was saying, let's stick with the house, and I've got this 25-foot separation, and there's no, other than going underneath the slab or going up through the attic and then back down. it's
yeah. There may be some wireless remote disconnects that you could look at. I know back in the day when we could have remote disconnecting combiner boxes, there were, the disconnect would then wirelessly or with the communication wire disconnect up at the array. So it might be worthwhile checking to see if there are any that are acceptable, that are out there that you could say, all right, it's going to have this Wi-Fi connection so that I've got a lever over here, but it's going to, yeah, Bill?
We all know that the inverter has to sync with the grid, and if the grid goes down by specification, inverters turn off. Has anyone heard of any instance where or why the NEC requires a lockable disconnect under those conditions? I mean, are there instances where somehow the solar went wrong and did feed power back to the grid and potentially shock a lineman?
I'll wait to see if anybody has. I don't have any information myself. I would guess whenever something can go wrong, it does go wrong, at some point. But I've never heard of them or seen any articles in the press. As far as it being lockable, my understanding though on that was just to keep people from being able to touch energized terminations. So the lockable aspect of it is that, they're just afraid that people, because it's got to be readily accessible, but then if anything that's readily accessible, somebody can access. So, you want to make sure that it could be locked.
Well, a year ago, that was not an issue, but apparently now with the IQ8, Enphase IQ8 inverters, there is the possibility of feeding back power back to the grid. So as long as the sun is out and it's producing proportionate to the amount of sunlight, then there is the possibility that it could be feeding back.
But you're not supposed to install that IQ8 without an auto disconnect.
Yes,
So,
correct.
although, just because you're not supposed to doesn't mean somebody's not going to.
The IQ8 controller, I think, will only build a microgrid if you buy the controller too, and you the IQ8s, the branch circuits are going into the combiner, and the Enphase combiner, and from there into the controller. And without the controller, they won't build a microgrid.
Yeah.
That's how I see that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, Jay?
Two things. And from my 40 years ago NIOSH time, the lockout, I presume, also means that once you've turned it off, you put in a lockout marker so that people can't turn it back on. Because I've saw a situation where people had turned off the valves for carbon monoxide for carbureting steel, and then somebody went back and opened the valve again.
Yeah. Well, of course, that would be the first responder's responsibility, but there is lockout tagout process that when you're working with electricity, you're supposed to follow, which involves notifying anybody who might be involved that it is going to be shut down, then locking it and tagging it as to, how to re-energize that. But my guess is that when first responders come to a fire, they're probably not going to go through that process. They're probably just going to turn things off and grab a hose. I don't know that they're going to lock it down. I mean, but.
So the other thing is, we have 32 panels, but we got 19 and then 13 more. And I'm quite sure our second panel says one of two disconnects. I don't know that the first one is labeled as one of two, but is that part of the rules that if you've got more than one set of disconnect, you put the number on?
Well, not the number, but it's got to be labeled as a PV disconnect. And I guess if you've got multiples, it would make sense to make sure they understand there are multiple disconnects involved. They've got to be labeled as such, and you can't have more than 6 disconnects at any one particular service location. So the 6 handle rule says, when these firefighters arrive, or anybody, the utility, they can't be running around figuring out if there can't be more than 6 handles that they disconnect. Now, where they came up with 6, who knows, but somebody decided I can deal with 6, but 7 is too many, 5 is too few, whatever. But if you do have more than that, let's say you've got an apartment complex where there are 20 tenants, each one having service, then typically you would have an aggregation panel where there'd be a master switch that you can pull that turns off, all 20 of them. So that would be another piece of equipment required. Siggy, did you have a comment on the disconnect thing?
Yeah, I just went through that exercise with a permitting office in Fort Myers. Now, Florida Power and Light down there, I read their interconnection agreement, and they don't necessarily demand a lockable manual disconnect, not necessarily. They're suggesting it, I think. So I didn't put one in, and we went straight from a microinverter system on a breaker. And it came back from the permitting office, and they said they want a lockable mechanism somehow. So I read up on it, and yes, the code actually says somewhere that the connection point needs to have a lockable solution that is not an add-on. So so went back and forth with the permitting office, and I figured that it would be enough if you just install a circuit breaker lock. That for the permitting office, that would have satisfied for permit. So, but then it went back and forth, and they said, you know what? In the end, FPNL they want one as well. So we said, okay, let's make it easy. Just put a 30 or whatever, 30 or 60 amp lockable disconnect on the outside. But by code, it's not necessarily needed. It's the utility that demands access from the outside and wants to put a padlock on there. But technically, you could put it on a breaker.
Yeah, I think you're going to find though that I know at least in the last code they added the lockable part, but you will find that the code, it depends on which code, of course, applies. You're down in Florida, so you may be dealing with the 1896 electrical code or whatever. But I think you're what 2017.
Yeah, 2017.
Yeah. So you've got to deal with whatever applies. But I was going to mention the interconnection agreement that you sign with your utility usually specifies that they want that disconnect, because that seems to be the thing they're worried about.
The Duke Energy, Duke Energy here in Pinellas County, their interconnection agreement says they recommend a lockable AC disconnect because if they see a problem with the solar system, they just lock out they just pull the meter. They just lock out the customer.
Oh,
so they wouldn't care. So they recommend, and I know why they recommend, because in Florida, we have an administrative code that requires the utility, if they demand that switch, to reimburse a customer $300-400 worth of switch and labor.
I would think as a utility, I would like to see a disconnect. So let's say I want to go work on your transformer. I'd like to be able to just turn the thing off while I'm working on that transformer.
You could just, if it's a load side connection, you can just, disconnect the residents. So.
Yeah, you could pull their meter, or you could disconnect them up there at the transformer for sure. But it's easier to walk over and flip a switch, at least for me.
Yeah, but there's no guarantee that there isn't a generator in the house too.
Yeah. Yeah,
well,
which would that'd be part of your 6-handle rule as well, because that's where you get into, if you've got generators, if you've got battery backup, if you've got, you can see that handles might start to accumulate out there, to disconnect a service.
But a generator should always be either behind the manual or automatic disconnect.
Yeah.
So you cannot have the utility and the generator in parallel. That's how it should be in each and every home sometimes it's not, but it should be.
Right, but I think what he was saying was if you flip the switch as the utility, you come out there to work on the transformer or something, then you just kicked on the homeowner's generator when you did that.
Yeah, it
And
could.
that's that.
But it would be isolated from the grid.
Yeah, I bet
In
they just
theory,
pull it. If it were me, I'd be extra cautious. Just pull the meter, and then I know there is just nothing there.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's probably where they would go, because they're pulling meters all the time. It's not, like a homeowner, you wouldn't pull the meter, but the utility company, not a big deal.
And one question.
Sure.
If you've got multiple branches for microinverters, Enphase in this case, if you got multiple branches coming down from the roof, can you use the disconnect as a branch aggregator?
Typically now with the Enphase system, you would use their combiner box because their communication system is integrated within that combiner box, and it's designed to handle four branch circuits. I don't know how you do a disconnect. I mean, you're talking about just doing a parallel wiring connection within the disconnect. Yeah, with just wire nuts or something, or bus bar. I mean, that's really Appalachian engineering as far as I would be concerned.
So Jay, basically, if you have multiple inverters in a system, I think you just need one main disconnect. Let's say for AC combiner, you don't really need to have separate disconnects for each inverter output.
Yeah, you can combine them and have one system disconnect. Yeah, because typically the disconnect is the last piece of equipment before you're making connection, either load side or supply side. So you would combine in some way multiple inverters, whether it's a microinverter system or a multiple string inverter. They would be combined in parallel somewhere before they get to the AC disconnect. I guess they might make AC disconnects that do allow for multiple connection points within that.
And it also has to be a fuse disconnect, not just a dedicated disconnect in most cases.
Yeah, are you saying it must be fused or it doesn't have to be fused?
Does it have to be a fuse disconnect where you keep your protection separate from the disconnect? Is there any
Yeah, there are some situations, it depends on the size of the system, where they do specifically say that the disconnect must be fused. I don't know, maybe one of you guys has a perspective on this, but to me, having a fuse and a disconnect is another level of safety. I don't see an advantage of an unfused disconnect. Maybe price, but I don't see there that big of a difference between it. Does anybody have a different perspective on that?
Well, if you're on the AC side of the inverter and you're putting a disconnect in, if it's on the line, if it's a line side tap, it has to be fused because it's the first entry point of the service and it needs to have overcurrent protection. So it's minimum 60 amp. But if it's on the load side, then you're connecting to a breaker and you can just use
okay.
You can use a break, you can use a disconnect meeting the utility requirements.
Yeah. But if you have like a fuse disconnect leading into a breaker, that's not going to cause you any problems either.
There's no advantage to that at all. It's just extra money.
Yeah, and it also might be a little bit of extra inconvenience because let's say the fuse pops, then you do a little bit of troubleshooting trying to figure out, because your breaker's just fine, but the fuse and the disconnect is popped and now you got to trace back to find where the problem is.
We lately had a little bit of a disconnect trouble with all our designs here in Tico Land and Tampa Electric Company. They just said broadly that, oh, whatever you do, if you do Enphase now, we always want to have an AC disconnect in front of the PV system. And that causes trouble when you do sunlight backup with the new Enphase system, because you can't, that would defy the purpose of having it if you have the AC disconnect in between your connection point and the controller. So, I told him, can't we put the AC disconnect in between the controller and the PV system? But they didn't like that. So now, if the utility thinks they're going to disconnect, they're actually going to disconnect the controller from the building.
Which is
so
not
then so now you don't have your backup loads.
Do they see that as a little bit safer from their perspective? They don't care that it doesn't work the way you want it to?
I think they just didn't. They just see that there is off-grid power and they want to be able to disconnect it and they want to have a disconnect in between. So
yeah. Well, one of the issues that we run into, especially with some of these utilities and with new technology, is they're just not that familiar with it. There's a long bit of education involved. I know at our home with the electric co-op, I called in saying I wanted to make a connection and they're like, well, you need to talk to Zach because he's the only guy who works here who knows anything about solar. And, he's on vacation, so you have to talk to him in 3 weeks, and that kind of thing. Nobody else there wanted to know anything about solar. So, that's the reality.
Well, what I'm saying is when you start using sunlight backup, the disconnect business is getting sensitive. You got to be careful how it's organized.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of issues around, like we're still talking about the Enphase 8 where you can where the system will work with or without batteries. And I think that's going to raise a number of issues because it only will work with the amount of power that's coming into it from the sunlight. So you've got variable load capacity as the sun is going in and out of clouds and things like that. And people's behavior will not correspond with the available power. So, so you're going to get a lot of popping of, you know, system shutdowns and this thing's crap. And how come I can't run my air conditioner when it's pouring rain outside and stuff like that. That's that they're just not anticipating.
Enphase highly recommends, or it's almost, they say shall use, the load shedding control. I think it's up to 4 circuits that you can shed off. And I had my own drawings red marked by Enphase, and they came back redlined by Enphase. And they said that I'm not supposed to put more than 30% of the PV rating in loads on the critical, as a critical load. So yeah, 30%. So that makes about sense. So about one third of the PV array can be critical load.
So they're saying during daylight hours, you should expect to be able to lose 70% of the power generation due to clouds and things like that.
And then they use, they highly recommend to put 4 load shedding breakers on there. So they're basically relay operated breakers from the controller, where I don't know how it's done. I have not programmed it or anything, but certain loads are being shedded first if there isn't enough power.
Well, you know, I think this is one of those issues when we're dealing with the general public and even people who are semi-informed. I ran into a call. They had wanted me to be a consultant on a project where they were looking at putting in these cookie cutter 1,500 watt little solar arrays in low income housing, you know, just on solar on a pole kind of things, where they were going to come in with the thing. And the project was slowly morphing into something that made 0 sense at all, where they said, well, okay, now we want to incorporate battery backup. And I said, all right, so you don't want a cookie cutter thing where you're putting solar on a pole. And they said, well, you know, these people need to be able to run their air conditioner if the grid goes down. I'm like, okay, a 1,500 watt array. I don't care what kind of battery system you're putting in there, you will not run your air conditioner for this particular, and then they're going, well, but you know, they've got some really good energy efficient air conditioning systems out there. I said, oh, is every low income house equipped with an energy efficient air conditioning unit? It's like, come on, guys, you know, and so I started throwing numbers out there, like, because they wanted space heaters. I said, all right, 1,500 watts. You've got a 1,500 watt air conditioner or space heater, one. Okay, that basically means the maximum you could run it is probably 1 hour a day. You know, what are you going to be doing? How, you know, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Anyway, so obviously I'm no longer their consultant, because I didn't tell them what they wanted to hear. So, that's one way to lose customers, be honest. All right, anybody else have anything to bring up on this before I hit some of the embodied energy thing? Let me just touch on it because it was raised to me. I don't even remember who raised it, but they said they had seen an article that electric vehicles actually consume more energy than an internal combustion engine vehicle. All right, which on its face didn't make any sense to me. Now it turns out there was a very famous article. Yeah, it was called "Hummers Are Greener Than Prius," which was out there, and it was based on a 2006 study that was completely debunked left and right. But there is, like most of these things, a tiny kernel of truth to it, in that the production of an electric vehicle does consume more energy than the production of an internal combustion engine because of the addition of the batteries, which does consume more energy. But when you talk about the energy saved and the pollution saved and all of that kind of thing, it's silly. So you know, it depends. And a lot of that is based on the fact that these vehicles are using fossil fuels to generate the electricity. So there's a bunch of different caveats involved to get to whatever it is that you wanted to get to in the first place. So that's kind of, but let me back up a little bit, and then we can throw that around a bit. The thing I did find, there's a thing called the energy payback of solar cells, and I touched on this a little bit earlier. When you factor in the mining, processing, production, transport, and use of a solar panel, there is a certain amount of embedded energy that it takes to create that solar panel. So how long will it take for that panel to recuperate all of the energy it took to make it? And that's referred to as the energy payback. Well, with a standard silicon panel, that energy payback will be 1.5 to 3 years, depending on where it's installed. You know, if you install it in a high sunshine area, it's going to be quicker. If you install it in Seattle, might be a little bit less, you know, more time. So that's typically going to be 1.5 to 3 years. Now, these panels are going to operate for 25 years. So clearly the payback is significant for the solar panel. If you get to thin film, then the payback will be within 0.8 to 0.9 years. So essentially 10, 11 months, it will pay for itself in the energy that's involved in creating it. And perovskite, we're talking about 2 to 4 months. So there's very little embedded energy in a perovskite panel. There's not that much in a solar panel, whatever. Then you get into how much CO2 is released, you know, in the production. And apparently they throw around these numbers. Typically, they've always held that every kilowatt of solar, in order to generate that, takes 2,560 kilograms of CO2. That's a number that's been out there. Who knows where that came from? There were a number of recent studies that found that the number is closer to about 600 kilograms. So really about 76% less embedded energy or pollutants associated with the creation of electricity through solar than was previously thought. Even at the higher number, solar proves to be about 11 to 18 times less polluting than combined cycle natural gas, which is about the most efficient of the fossil fuels, and significantly more for coal power. So however you cut it, solar's good, unless you don't like solar, and then it's bad because you can find some reason. I always like Mark Twain's line about there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. So there are lies, damn lies, and studies that you can have. And there is the one that's going around now, the one about EVs being more polluting than fuel, than gas. That was based on a study by MIT, which is being essentially misinterpreted. I think they were just looking at a very narrow perspective that an automobile production plus batteries takes more energy than just an automobile production, which seems like that makes sense. I don't know. So I don't know. Tony, do you get involved, or have you been getting any of this pushback?
Yeah, of course I have. I was trying to make it one call without getting too super spicy, but can't even make it one call. Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is there's a tremendous amount of misinformation. Some of it is totally just people just trying to figure stuff out and trying to come to the right answer. And a lot of it is just deliberate misdirection and misinformation, right? I mean, you touched on how ridiculous it is to incorporate essentially the energy usage as part of your vehicle production on one side and then not on the other. Like that's just like that's the most like Yeah, sure. Now let me know what you find with pollution and cost and CO2 if you have the if you include gas in your tank for 10 years. Let me know how that math works out for you. Right. So there's a ton of like misdirection, misinformation, not counting things that obviously any normal person should count when you're trying to compare apples to apples. And there's been a lot of studies that, pretty recently that have again have to go out and debunk a lot of this misinformation that's out there.
Mhm. Yep, I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that clearly there is an energy cost and there is a pollution cost to generating power using any renewable source.
Yeah, sure.
There is, but it's compared to our traditional sources, it's night and day. We're solar, wind, those technologies are considered green for a legitimate reason.
What about hydrogen?
Hydrogen. Oh my God! Now you're into my pet peeve. Hydrogen. Hydrogen is a mess. Typically, hydrogen is, as I always like to say, it's the technology of the future, and it always will be. It's
Like fusion.
Yeah, it's always, people talk about fusion, and I say we have fusion energy. It's called the sun. It's
It's
like,
crazy. We use it. It's you can use it right now. It's marketable today. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, the big problem is with hydrogen is how it is marketed and how it is actually created. They talk about, let's just take water and through electrolysis, we make oxygen and we make hydrogen. Isn't that wonderful? The only outgassing is going to be oxygen, which, makes the world a kumbaya kind of place. The reality is that almost all hydrogen is manufactured through natural gas, and that the energy output of the hydrogen is less than if you just burn the natural gas. So what's the point? And then hydrogen is a very, very small atom. So the storage and transport of hydrogen is very problematic. It will find its way through any metal container. So typically the hydrogen has to be produced where it is consumed, because storage and distribution of hydrogen is very difficult. It's got to be cryogenically frozen under high pressure, things of that nature. So you typically have natural gas coming in, they produce some hydrogen, and then they use it right at that location. So all that said, technology today, hydrogen makes no sense unless you are a petrochemical company looking to get government funding under the auspice of you are suddenly green. And so it's ways of funneling huge billions of dollars of government money into projects that don't have to go anywhere. So that's not that I'm biased in any stretch of the imagination on this, but it's a lot of money being thrown into. So
plus the fact the automotive industry has had hydrogen vehicles for 40 years now.
Yeah, they've been around for a while. Toyota, the Mariah, I think, is the only real commercial hydrogen vehicle. And California tried to do their hydrogen highway thing where they invested billions of dollars, but none of the pumps ever worked and nobody ever used them. And I mean, you've got an infrastructure issue that you got to deal with. And that said, I can see a role for hydrogen in some very narrow bands some point in the future. And that is once we have a huge amount of installed renewables that would have to be curtailed during periods of demand, so you're basically zero cost of energy right off the bat. Then you can have some very inefficient processes that could perhaps cost effectively store some form of energy, some sort of hydrogen energy. But we're not anywhere close to that. And by the time we get close to that, we'll probably have a lot better ideas than simply wasting energy to create hydrogen. I I think we can.
And Jay, just to piggyback on that, like, this is a super nerdy kind of, gnat's ass detail, but a lot of these solar projects are financed on, PPA basis. So they spend a lot of time, effort, analysis on making sure they're specifically not going crazy and overbuilding renewables. So this, like, you're 100% right. The only way that this will happen is if you got to figure out this awkward duck curve, nationally or internationally. But I think, we're even so far away from that, because all of these projects are pretty dialed in and pretty accurate on making sure that they can get rid of or use, every drop of solar that comes in. So this whole idea that we're just going to have this, we're going to overbuild and not pay for it, and then we're just going to have all this excess sun to waste on, like, hydrogen or crypto mining or something, is interesting. The other thing that I'll mention about the EV thing is, I won't belabor this point, but I think something that's often missed is when we're talking about localized pollution, when we're internal combustion engines versus electric vehicles, right? It's a fundamentally different proposition to even tap into the grid to charge your electric vehicles if it's predominantly natural gas from a centrally managed and sequestered power plant, than it is to burn unleaded gasoline as you're traveling, through schools and neighborhoods. So the localized pollution issue, I think, is not talked about enough. And just depending on, how much sleep I got the night before with these arguments, I'll challenge someone. I'll go in my garage with an electric vehicle, you go in yours, close the door and turn it on, and call me every hour and let me know how that works out for you, right? Probably not going to work out super well for the folks who are rocking ICE vehicles. And you're throwing that out as you're driving, right? It's obviously getting diluted as you in the earth, but it's still, it will literally kill you if you use it in a confined space. So I think using that as just a reminder is pretty important as we roll this out.
Sure. And just to define some of your acronyms, ICE meaning internal combustion engine, and PPA, power purchase agreement, which is essentially, as I mentioned earlier in the news, a process that you have to go through to get these systems approved when it's a way that you buy from an investor, you buy your power from the investor, but there are mechanisms to determine just how much can be added to the grid, where it can be added to the grid, how it can be added to the grid. So we're getting, well, let me touch real quick on the EV thing, because Don had sent me something, and we had talked about before. Let's see if I can share my screen. Oh, there we go. My computer's being very slow. See if we get, it's giving you channel analytics instead of could y'all, trying to share the right window here. If I can't, I'll just shut it down. Yeah, computer's being too slow for sharing. I'm gonna stop that if I can. Anyway, the issues that I wanted to raise had to do with some of these electric vehicles that are out there on the marketplace. We talked about how this is all going to be changing. Everybody's going to electric vehicles, and so there's a couple of interesting ones. The Aptera is one that Don was showing me that looks very futuristic, very cool. That's not really in the slow or in the cheap category. It said 26,000 to 45,000. Gets 1,000 miles per charge, which is really quite impressive, and 0 to 1,000,000 miles an hour in 2 seconds. But the ones that I'm interested in are some of these, like the Dutch car Squad Mobility, which is a little, these things they look to me more like glorified golf carts, but they're kind of being advertised as city vehicles where they get top 28 mile per hour kind of speed, but the costs are very, very low. There's an interesting one from China called the Mini EV, has a price tag of $4,200 for that vehicle, 170 mile range on it. Actually looks like kind of a real car. So that when you start talking about legitimate vehicles for $4,200, that's kind of a game changer there. And there's a California one called Candy America Model K27. That has a price tag of $8,000, speed of about 35 miles per hour, range of 116. So I know, Tony, I keep going back to you because we're kind of in the world of EV, but and you're doing all your EV charging stations and the like, but do you know of any other ones out there, some of these that are coming up where and can you envision a world where the cities are full of these little, you know, two-seater golf cart type EV world?
Yeah, it's a phenomenal question, Jay. I spent a lot of time talking to micro mobility folks pretty recently. I don't know if that's, you know, a lot of this is, you know, certain ideas might work great elsewhere. You talked about the Mini, you know, very familiar with the Mini with some of the stuff that we're looking at in China. Micro mobility solutions, so scooters, by electric, you know, e-scooters, e-bikes, pretty big. I don't know, there's this, you have to factor in like American culture into a lot of this, right? Like a lot of people look at the Mini EV or the Aptera and they just kind of shake their head and say, I wouldn't be caught dead in that. So I'm not super bullish on, you know, tiny electric vehicles, because I just don't think that right or wrong, I just don't think that matches kind of the American way of transport. And I mean, you know, we could say it's right or wrong. You can be right or you can be rich, right? Like it doesn't matter what we should do. It's just kind of what are people buying, right? Like the F-150 Lightning, people are going to buy that. People are going to drive that, right? Like that's a solution. That's a solution that a lot of folks are going to roll out. There's an interesting one. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called Lightspeed. Let me throw it in the chat. Ridiculous from a cost perspective. Lightspeed Zero, I believe it's called. It's I think it's like $250,000 light year. Sorry, $250,000. It's 5 point something square meters of solar that cover the car, carbon fiber for a body. It looks like a sedan. It kind of looks like a Model S, kind of a classic sedan, only it's, you know, 100% solar. You know, the specs are a little, it looks cool, but the specs are a little, let's forget that it's $250,000 for a second. You know, the specs are kind of, from a performance perspective, are pretty low, like kind of ridiculously slow, 0 to 60 time, you know, top speed, but all of that, I mean, you've got to take it from somewhere if you're trying to be, you know, entirely solar. A lot of different ideas out there as far as what that looks like. I mean, obviously, you know, we've thought it makes sense to combine solar and EVs, just maybe not on every single car. So there's a lot of interesting solutions out there.
I wonder if there's not a marketplace that will evolve. When I was looking at some of these cheaper ones, they reminded me of golf carts or little EVs, or not EVs, but four-wheelers. And around our area, it seems like everybody's got four-wheelers. And it strikes me that that's an electric vehicle market that could easily take place, because these are not on-road vehicles. At least they're not intended for that, although they're used that way a lot around here. But I just wonder if the four-wheeler, farm utility type vehicle seems a natural for electric as opposed to gasoline.
Yeah, I actually toured, there's in Ohio, I think it's these guys. A while back, I toured these guys' plant. It's, it's a small business, but they're doing great work. And got to ride around on an electric quad, which is interesting because it's really fast, really quick, and really quiet. So, that was kind of an interesting thing. I think golf carts is very interesting. I had a conversation with some folks who live in the villages down in Florida, and there's a huge demand for electric golf carts. That's like the default mode of transportation down in the villages.
Yeah.
I think that's also true on just normal golf course. It's something that makes sense to electrify, and a lot of the solutions right now are just kind of shitty, to be blunt. So I think that that's ripe for disruption. Folks that can find reliable, safe battery kind of skateboard concept and drop that in. And we're not talking about super complex. Drop that in a golf cart. There's a ton of niches, right? I just got off a call yesterday with some folks who want like all boats, like recreational watercraft, is ripe for being completely electrified. There's not.
I know marine boats. When I was doing a study on pollution, boats are heavily polluting.
They're heavily polluting.
And they're loud.
They're loud. It's an illogical purchase decision, right? Like it's really expensive up front, a lot of money to maintain. I was looking at some figures that was over $1,000 per hour of actually in a boat. When you factor in transporting it, paying for the maintenance, weatherizing it in the winter, whatever, you're talking about thousands sometimes per hour of usage. So it's an illogical, just from a purely financial perspective, an illogical decision to buy it. But why that matters from an electrification perspective is it's not as sensitive as a price point as you're talking about cars. So you could drop an expensive electric boat, people would pay for it to be quiet, to be less kind of smelly, to reduce maintenance costs. And there's not really an apex predator. There's not like a Tesla equivalent in that world. GM Ventures just put in a lot of money, 10, 20, $30 million into one company. But that's something that I think is pretty, you talk about speed, there's a lot of things that you could kind of scratch a lot of itches for folks who ride. I mean, imagine an electric jet ski or electric cigar boat, right? I mean, you're talking about bonkers fast. And it also works with pontoon boats, right? Some smaller watercraft as well. So there's a lot that needs electrified. And it's a really exciting time to be alive.
Yep. Okay, well, that sounds like something we could do some research on, because I'd love to figure out more about what's going on in the world of boats. Anyway, we're at the end of our hour, so I appreciate everybody being here, and we'll see you all next Tuesday. Okay, take care. Thanks.
Okay.